Hello and welcome back to ThoughtBat. Today we're going to be asking the age-old question, is capitalism really voluntary? Is it really an economic system compatible with a sense of freedom? So, to start off, let's define some terms. Here, by capitalism, I do mean an economic system whereby trade is conducted via a medium of absentee property titles, whereby capital is manipulated by a group of wage labourers who do not own it, and the product of a labour is sold on for the profit of those that do. When we speak of freedom in a capitalist society, the conversation often turns to choice. The ability to choose between employers, between products, between lifestyles is presented as evidence that we do live in a voluntary system. But what does voluntariness really mean when the basic means of survival, food, shelter, healthcare, are controlled by others? So today I want to examine this question through the lens of a long-standing critique of capitalism, that its hierarchies, though dressed in the language of contract and consent, are not truly voluntary. To do so, I'll begin with a simple thought experiment: an island where the resources of life are privately owned. I'll show how this scenario reveals structural coercion at the heart of wage labour, even in societies which claim to be free. From there, I'll explore two familiar alternatives. We've got state-regulated capitalism, i.e. liberalism, and anarcho-capitalism, which is just liberalism extreme. Both offer us partial solutions, but both, I'll argue, leave us with deep contradictions. Finally, I'll present a third path, which is mutualism, a philosophy of markets without capitalism, property without landlords, and competition without exploitation. I'll suggest that mutualism offers a coherent way to preserve the dynamism of free exchange while eliminating the structural coercion that undermines genuine voluntariness in our economic relations. I'm going with these three and avoiding discussions of non-market models for now for sake of simplicity. Communism and socialism require videos of their own to effectively discuss them with the attention that they deserve. So, let's begin with the well-known desert island hypotheticals. These hypotheticals are popular in political philosophy because they help simplify social relations in order for the core issue to be assessed. Then, the aim is to build up the island scenario towards something which looks like a modern society to see how any principles or systems would apply going forward, identifying relevant factors which may change our view about any given standard. This way of doing political philosophy stretches back to John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Rousseau, and even the mutualist Proudhon himself, who in What is Property describes a stranded sailor being denied shelter on a privately owned island to emphasize the coercive nature of property. So, let's begin. Imagine yourself waking up alone on an island. You quickly discover that all the fertile land, all the fresh water sources, and all the tools of survival are owned by another person. Now you need food, you need shelter, and you need water. But to access any of these, you need to ask permission. And permission is conditional. You must follow the owner's rules. Now at this point you may be told that this is a voluntary arrangement. After all, no one is physically forcing you to comply. But what choice do you really have? If you refuse, you die. Consent under such conditions are not meaningfully free, it is coerced by an artificial necessity. And by artificial necessity, I mean the idea that land and resources can be infinitely accumulated and gatekept, whilst everyone else is obliged to honour such entitlements, is not necessitated by nature, and, as this video aims to show, it's not even prompted to us by economic utility. To paint the picture, let's say you ask the owner of this island for some food. He might be willing to let you have some for nothing. Maybe he's just a chill guy. But what if he's less generous? What if he asks you to do some work for him in exchange for the food? Most people may see this as a very normal arrangement in such a remote setting, given how similar it is to our capitalist society. But we're just skipping the step of the owner providing a wage so that the workers can buy up his means of living elsewhere. But let's crank things up. What if in exchange for access to essential resources, he requires you to provide sexual favours? What if, enabled by your desperate situation combined with your duty to respect the owner's property rights, he demands that you perform tasks which you'd consider unthinkable had your needs been met? I'm effectively painting a vulgar image of price gouging, which we do indeed observe when supply fails to meet demand, as it does under usual circumstances. Many people already may not regard these exchanges as voluntary, given their extreme nature and the fact they're enabled only by the desperate situation of a non-owner. But if these exchanges are not voluntary, then why would any other exchange be voluntary, given the workers agreeing to them in identical circumstances? And this is the key question here in our island hypothetical, which needs to be answered by the defender of capitalism. Now, you've probably heard this thought experiment before as the coconut island analogy, and yes, this is exactly that. But I find when many critics of property use it, they miss the fundamental point that it's not the exchange itself that is problematic, but the artificial necessity of the exchange. So without the island owner claiming title to the island in the first place, these arrangements would not need to be made by the castaway, and it is this state of affairs which is producing the involuntary hierarchy. The castaway has never agreed that the owner is to be in a position to demand favours exchange for resources. And so the question must be shifted to what models of property are we ethically committed to, given that they're contingent on social recognition. Let's add to the problem. Let's get into a deeper concern about property itself, and that is the contradictory relationship it has with personal autonomy. The relationship between property and autonomy is often presented as quite straightforward. Property is said to secure liberty, to give individuals a sphere of inviolable control against the encroachment of others. Yet when we look closer, this story starts to unravel. A regime of strict property norms, where all land and space is privately owned, the very liberties we take to be essential markers of autonomy become conditional, contingent upon the goodwill of property holders. Free speech, for example, is not truly free if it can only be exercised on land one personally owns, or with the permission of somebody else. A public square ceases to be a place of a democratic assembly. It is merely an atrium owned by a landlord, whose tolerance or intolerance defines the limit of political participation. The same logic extends to other freedoms held up as inviolable. Religious expression, or the choice to live openly in a homosexual relationship, or even the mundane right to use one's own possessions in one's own dwelling, all of these hinge not on any abstract principle of liberty, but on the property arrangements underpinning the space in which life is conducted. If a landowner disapproves of your faith, your sexuality, or your politics, they need not argue with you. They need only to evict you or deny access to the ground beneath your feet. In this way, strict property norms invert the liberal narrative. Property is no longer the guarantor of autonomy, but it is its precondition and constraint. What we consider basic freedoms are reduced to privileges, granted or withheld at the discretion of those who hold title to the earth itself. And it's all well and good saying, but you agreed to be on that land in the first place. But this is ignoring the artificial necessity of appealing to a landowner's whims in the first place. Property is not a natural phenomenon that came along with a Big Bang. It's a social relation, which emerged out of habitual social interaction. And so this isn't all necessary. This isn't something that we have to abide by. This isn't the way it needs to be. Some will object, what if the island has multiple owners? Suppose 4 or 5 individuals each control a portion of the land and resources. Isn't this better? Doesn't competition between them make your consent more meaningful? Well, it certainly changes the dynamic. Instead of negotiating with a single monopolist, you now bargain between rival landlords. But your underlying dependence remains. You cannot live on the island without access to resources you do not own. Your survival is still conditional upon the terms set by property owners. And this is the essential point. Whether monopoly or oligopoly, whether one landlord or many, your supposed choice is not the free choice of an equal, it is the constrained choice of someone whose very survival depends on the goodwill of those who own what he needs to live. And remember, you never consented to this arrangement in the first place, whereby all the land and resources you need are gatekept by a respective owner whose whims you need to satisfy in order to have access to them, in order to live. And this, the argument goes, is not unlike our situation in the real world. In modern capitalist economies, the means of sustenance are not scattered across beaches and streams, but are concentrated in markets, factories, and supply chains. Land, resources, and capital are overwhelmingly owned by a minority. To survive, the rest of us must sell our labour to those who hold that ownership. Now, one might respond again and say this is all voluntary. After all, you're not compelled to work for any particular employer. You can choose among them. If you don't like one job, you can apply for another. And in theory, you could even start your own business. But obviously this defence quickly collapses under scrutiny. The ability to choose between employers, like with the island, does not remove the fundamental asymmetry. Whether you work for firm A or firm B, or live in the property of landlord X or landlord Y, you are still dependent on those who own the means of production, and you never consented to such a structured arrangement being set up in the first place. I'm going to hammer that point home throughout the video. Just as on the island, you can select between your landlords, but you cannot opt out of landlordism itself. And the option to start your own business, whilst real for some, does not change the overall structure. The vast majority lack the capital, the credit, the security to do so. Markets are dominated by established firms with deep reserves and enormous competitive advantages. Even when small businesses emerge, they often struggle to survive in markets stacked against them. To say you can just start your own company or you can just not interact with capitalism is very little different from telling the islander, you can just swim into the ocean. Technically true, but practically meaningless when survival is at stake. Thus we arrive at a conclusion. Capitalist hierarchy, where one class owns and another depends, cannot meaningfully be called voluntary. So at this point, the defenders of capitalism often turn to the role of the state. Yes, they concede, capitalism does produce inequalities, but the state exists to soften the blow. It provides safety nets, minimum wages, union recognition, public education, and social mobility programs. It prevents the worst forms of exploitation, the Liberal says, like those alluded to on the desert island. And it ensures that the hierarchy does not become unbearable. And to a degree, this is certainly true. Welfare states have lifted millions out of destitution. Regulations have curbed the most abusive labour practices. Public services have expanded opportunities for those who would otherwise be trapped in cycles of poverty. Take the Nordic welfare states, for example. In 2011, poverty rates dropped by nearly 19%, compared to only the 10.9% in the US. In the UK, during the COVID response, a fleeting universal credit uplift lifted almost 400,000 people out of absolute poverty. Historically, the late 90s, the Labour Party's welfare expansions lifted 2.4 million people out of poverty, thanks to tax credits and child benefits. These figures, and there's a lot more where they came from, do show that redistributive policies aren't just ideological, they demonstrably transform lives, and they're essential to curbing the impoverishing nature of capitalism. But, and there is a but, the state does do more than protect workers. It also protects capital. It enforces licensing regimes, intellectual property laws, subsidies, tariffs, and public contracts, which often serve to entrench existing firms and stifle new entrants to the market. Planning permissions and regulatory capture tilt markets towards those already established, limiting the dynamism that free competition is supposed to provide. In this sense, the state is Janus faced. On the one hand, it assists workers in climbing the social ladder. On the other hand, it props up the very class divisions that make the climb necessary in the first place. State capitalism thus functions as a delicate balancing act, somewhat of a ductate state. It prevents collapse by restraining exploitation, while simultaneously sustaining the structures of exploitation itself. And this isn't an unexpected feature of the state either, before the minarchists pipe up. Given the financial capital available to established businesses, they have a stronger leverage on political lobbying, which can influence policymaking in ways which secure their market dominance against new or smaller competitors. Going the other way, the state benefits from having a more stable and predictable market, which allows for better planning given more confident estimations of tax revenue. History offers us sharp examples. The Interstate Commerce Commission was created to tame railroad power, but ended up enabling cartel behavior instead. In finance, regulators' cozy ties with big banks left markets exposed before the 2008 crash. And in telecom, FCC officials have famously passed through the revolving door into industry roles, reinforcing cartels. Even market access mechanisms reflect this logic. In the United States, regulations make building new power lines a years-long process, which protects regional utilities that own the infrastructure. Import quotas on sugar protect a handful of domestic producers, raising prices for everybody else. Licensing and compliance burdens favour large-scale firms who can afford bureaucratic complexity, further marginalising smaller competitors. Subsidies add another layer. In the UK, large firms receive most public funds, especially sums exceeding £100 million, even as micro-enterprises struggle for support. And in China, data shows that less productive firms, i.e. not growing ones, get the largest subsidies, which then correlate with a lower productivity growth. Taken together, these patterns show how state regulation and support often entrench the power of existing capital, undermining the competition and dynamism promised by capitalism. So enter the anarcho-capitalist. If the state entangles us in all these contradictions, then perhaps we should dispense with the state altogether. This is the anarcho-capitalist proposal. Delete the state, remove regulations, strip away the subsidies, abolish licensing requirements, and allow markets to operate without state interference. So the promise here is dynamism. Without protectionist barriers, competition flourishes. New businesses enter the market more easily, consumers and even workers enjoy greater choice. And entrepreneurs, no longer burdened by bureaucratic red tape, can innovate freely. But anarcho-capitalism comes at a steep cost. Pardon the pun. By eliminating worker protections, it exposes individuals to the full force of market dependency. Without minimum wages, union rights, or welfare systems, workers are left to negotiate entirely on the terms set by those who control resources and capital. We're effectively back to the island situation. Bosses can set wages as low as they can make profitable, and landlords can make rent as high as they wish, given the supply of housing fails to meet demand. Landowners can infinitely accumulate land titles until there's nowhere left to homestead, and even structures like privately owned towns may become a reality. Given this sharp shift in the balance of power between the owners and the non-owners, exploitative practices can emerge without legal recourse. Landlords can demand their sexual favours from tenants at threat of eviction, bosses can bully their employees into accepting lower paychecks, and they can even start cutting corners on safety and hygiene standards in the workplace. They're not even required to allow for work breaks. Their workers will just eat shit and piss if and only if they're allowed to do so by their boss. Without labour laws, workplace exploitation becomes not theoretical, but an everyday reality. So, for example, in early industrial Britain, children as young as 4 laboured in mines and factories for 12 to 15 hours a day, often in life-threatening circumstances, until late campaigners forced reform. ANCAPs have made the argument that the private sector was already reducing the extent of child labour up until it was banned. But this leaves out the fact that they were incentivised to prepare for the ban, which was becoming increasingly likely in the years building up to it, ensuring that once the ban was inevitably enacted, they'd have a legal adult workforce to continue production. In modern times, consider garment workers in Leicester, migrants earning barely £3 to £4 an hour, working in blatant health and safety breaches, and often blocked from legal recourse through complex subcontracting chains. Historically, the Gilded Age in the United States shows what laissez-faire can look like. Again, child labour, deadly workplace injuries, and suppression of worker organising with private cops and violence. And look today. In low regulation sectors, workers face erratic schedules to deny benefits, denied overtime unless a crisis happens, and gendered wage gaps baked into workplace structures. Or because without enforceable labour rights, capital can wield power without limits. Increased competition at the top does not mean exploitation at the bottom ceases. You only need to watch a couple of episodes of Ramsay's Kitchen Nightmares to see how small business owners mistreat their workers and even fail to provide their paychecks on time. Many dictatorships are common even in companies which don't receive as much state protection as their larger competitors. And in a world where everything is up to business owners, there's no reason to expect this problem won't worsen within SMEs. Anarcho-capitalism certainly does not resolve the problem of coerced consent. If anything, it deepens it. The island has not disappeared, it has simply grown larger, and the landlords are more numerous. But this time, their powers expand to infrastructure and all public services, including policing and adjudication. You may now choose between competing masters, but the structure of mastery, which is not chosen by the servants, remains. Thus, anarcho-capitalism offers us freedom only in the thinnest sense. The freedom to choose which authority we submit to, or risk destitution if we refuse. So, where does this leave us? So on the one hand, we have state capitalism, protecting workers but entrenching monopolies, and then we have anarcho-capitalism, which enhances competition but abandons workers to exploitation. Is there a third path? Well, this is where mutualism enters. Mutualism proposes that workers themselves own and govern the enterprises in which they labour. Instead of selling labour to a boss, workers form cooperatives, sharing both profits and decision-making responsibilities. Instead of depending on absentee landlords for land and capital, communities pool resources through mutual credit systems, ensuring access to productive property is widely distributed. The effects of this is twofold. First, it eliminates capitalist exploitation at the root. If workers own their firms, then there is no class of owners siphoning profit from the labour. The coercion inherent in wage labour disappears, because no one's survival is contingent upon obeying an external master. Second, it preserves the benefits of market competition. Worker-owned firms still compete with one another. They still innovate, they still respond to consumer demand, and they still face the discipline of efficiency. But they do so on a level playing field, without the distortions of state favouritism or the entrenched privilege of inherited capital. In other words, mutualism combines the dynamism of anarcho-capitalism with the worker protections of state capitalism, but without requiring the paternalistic state or an exploitative class structure. But can mutualism actually work? Well, let's address some common concerns. How do we get from capitalism to mutualism? Well, here history offers us guidance. Cooperatives, credit unions, and community land trusts already exist within capitalism. They prove that worker-owned institutions can compete and thrive. Mondragon in Spain, with over 70,000 worker owners, is one of the most successful examples. The cooperative sector in Emilia-Romagna, in Italy, demonstrates how federated networks of co-ops can become the backbone of a regional economy. Mutualism doesn't require revolution. Revolutions are uncontrolled outbreaks of political violence, and given the chaos that they ensue throughout the duration, the result is often a paranoid, hyper-authoritarian state geared towards preventing another revolution occurring again. Instead, the mutualist sector grows gradually, through the expansion of the cooperative user-owned institutions, supported by mutual credit banks, that provide accessible loans to worker owners. But won't co-ops be crushed by capitalist firms? Well, evidence suggests otherwise. Worker owners tend to be more committed, reducing turnover and improving productivity. They avoid the inefficiencies of shareholder management conflict because the workers are the shareholders themselves. And because ownership is dispersed, wealth concentration and thus monopolization is far harder to sustain. But then the question may be posed: if cooperative firms are so much more efficient and attractive, and they're allowed to exist under capitalism, then why haven't they spread like wildfire and outcompeted traditional firms already? Well, the answer is down to incentive structures tied to absentee property protections. Similar to how it's possible not to have a patent over an idea or a design within capitalism, there's a strong incentive for those who have the ability to start a business to adopt a business structure which benefits the owner most, and this is not what a cooperative offers. The ability for entrepreneurs to opt for exploitation through top-down structures and patent monopolies is combined with a strong incentive to do so from an investment point of view, and so cooperatives are not the preferred model for new entrepreneurs looking to maximize their profits. What the workers want doesn't matter so long as they're not the ones in a position to be calling the shots. And this stresses a need to not just sit back and hope that the cooperative sector outgrows capitalism on its own, but the sector must be assisted by anarchist advocacy. Federations and unions must prioritise and supplement the growth of mutualistic institutions if they are to have a chance of genuinely providing a realistic alternative to capitalist domination. Cooperative enterprises consistently demonstrate economic advantages over conventional firms. In Italy, worker co-ops formed to save failing businesses achieve a 3-year survival rate of 87%, compared to 48% for all firms. In France, co-ops weathered the 2008 crisis with 80 to 90% 3-year survival, while non-co-ops hit 66%. In the UK, 76% of starter co-ops survived the first 5 years versus the 42% for all new businesses. During the 2008 financial crisis, European cooperative banks, which made up 20% of the market, accounted for just 7% of losses whilst continuing to support small businesses. In the United States, credit unions had 5 times lower failure rates and doubled small business lending to $60 billion, even as overall lending collapsed. IMF research finds cooperative banks enjoy greater stability thanks to lower return volatility and the ability to use member surplus as buffers, raising the resilience of the whole banking systems. In rural India, agricultural credit societies served nearly all villages, extending affordable credit and financial inclusion to disadvantaged communities. Cooperative banks and credit unions reinvest locally and offer better terms, foster trust and support for local development, embedding economic benefits within their communities. And what about healthcare, education and infrastructure? Mutualism addresses this through federations of cooperatives, pooling resources again for common goods. Cooperative healthcare systems already exist and have existed prior to the NHS in England. Mutual schools and community-run infrastructure are viable extensions. Polycentric governance, as described by Eleanor Ostrom and my own video, Introduction to Anarchist Legal Order, show how networks of associations can provide public goods without centralized authority. While anarcho-capitalism promises competition but ignores starting conditions, those inherent wealth and land retain permanent advantages. Mutualism prevents this by opposing absentee ownership. Land and capital must be directly used by those who hold them. This keeps each generation on a more equal footing, ensuring that markets remain genuinely open and meritocratic. So, to crystallize the point, let me put it into 3 phrases. 1. Freedom without exploitation. Mutualism ensures contracts are genuinely voluntary because no one is forced to sell labour to another under duress of survival. 2. Markets without monopolies. Mutualism delivers real competition, unencumbered by state protectionism and undistorted by inherited privilege. 3. Self-rule in the workplace. Mutualism democratizes the economy, giving people control where they spend most of their waking lives. In conclusion, the island thought experiment reveals the core problem of capitalist hierarchy. It presents itself as voluntary, but in reality it coerces consent through dependence on owners of the means of life. State capitalism seeks to manage this contradiction, offering protections whilst entrenching monopolies. Anarcho-capitalism seeks to remove the state, offering more competition, but exposing workers to the worst exploitation. Mutualism, by contrast, resolves this dilemma. It eliminates exploitation by making workers owners, whilst preserving competition through markets free of state privilege. It provides collective goods through federations or co-ops, rather than through paternalistic states or coercive landlords. In short, mutualism takes the best of both worlds, the dynamism of the free markets and the security of worker protections, and the freedom of self-governance. It offers us a vision of a society where economic life is not submission to an authority, but cooperation amongst equals. If we're serious about freedom not just as the absence of chains, but as the presence of autonomy and dignity, then mutualism deserves a lot more attention than we already give it. I hope you enjoyed this video. I thank you for watching, and goodbye.